Hello, I'm Tyler Grieve for TLED 636. My project is titled Routines, Formative Culture, and Student Voice in 7th Grade Environmental Science. Before I begin, I do want to note a concept that I think frames this whole project, and it happens to be my favorite word. It is titled anosognosia, or that's the term. It's a scientific term, but the way it's defined, I sort of rework it in this way. So, define it as the inability to recognize one's own blind spots. In my personal life, and certainly in classroom research, especially when examining authority and culturally sustaining pedagogies, I definitely want to recognize the limits of my own perception. And so I try my best to constantly challenge myself, reflect, re-reflect, and then name the parts that I don't necessarily see so I can grow with my students and my peers and community at large, right? So I did observe Mrs. L's classroom for 15 one-hour sessions, and I'll share my researcher identity, methods that I observed, 3 emerging themes, and implications and questions for feedback later on. So I carry, as a researcher, I bring several identity frames that shape what I notice and observe. I grew up in a strict evangelical environment. Don't worry, I still have huge respect for religion and the role it has in people's lives, including my own, okay? But I do have to call it what it was. So you'll see it on that slide. I called it a cult. I do identify as bisexual. It took me a while in my adulthood to come to terms with that. And I attended under-resourced public schools my entire life. My school district was the city trailer park area where I grew up. And later entering, obviously, better resource institutions like Old Dominion. So these experiences make me particularly attuned to power and how those relationships and dynamics will play out. Certainly belonging was a theme, or is a theme, and growing up marginalized and the emotional responses of that, and the way that teacher language can either empower students or shut them down in and out of the classroom, by the way, right? I also work at the school that I observed, and it is my second year, so I share many of the same students with Miss L. This is a small lottery-based school in the city, and the accepted student body is designed to reflect the exact demographics of the city. So for example, if an Asian male leaves the school in, let's say, 4th grade, the school will admit a 4th grader, Asian male, to maintain that balance. The school's mission is to develop students who are highly motivated, mature, self-confident, and who demonstrate excellent learning behaviors and social skills. And this adds another layer to how I interpret what success looks like here, right? And all of this is why I open with the nosonosia, that term, and it's a reminder to check my own blind spots about authority, about culture, about my own privilege or lack thereof, as I interpret what it is that I saw. So again, my site was Mrs. L's 7th grade environmental science class. Yes, that's obviously a pseudonym. The room has tall lab tables, assigned seats. There was a well-known pink chair reward. So for example, so if a student was showing something to the school's mission statement, or they have an acronym for showing respect, inspiring, safety, or excellence, especially if you got a great achievement, academic achievement in our class. They got to sit in this big fancy pink chair, while everybody else had to sit at the lab tables. The class includes students with IEPs, 2, I believe. Yes, a few 504s and 1 ELL student. So before we get to more of that, I do want to note here lightly that Miss L runs her classroom almost like a beloved, joyful military school at times. And because routines are so tight, I was hyper aware of even small deviations. So I was worried I might be overreading the ELL students' responses sometimes, simply because any change in behavior stood out so sharply in such a structured environment. And maybe that's the point. So I just, with that caveat there, keep that in mind. I completed 15 observation hours during the late morning, late lunch block from September to November. I collected jottings, full field notes, demographic scans, analytic reflections, artifacts such as study guides. They have glowing grow sheets. We'll talk about that later on. Yeah. So the first key theme that I want to discuss is Miss L's consistent formative routines. She used colored popsicle sticks that showed student mastery of understanding from red to purple. And even if those sticks weren't available, she would ask you to find a color-coded object to hold up. So if you mastered a subject, you had to hold up the purple. If you were kind of on the lower end, you would hold up a red. She did a lot of quick writes, a lot of quick draws. It is a science class, so that was really cool to see the students actually draw this out like an animal cell or a plant cell. She consistently highlighted routines. She had this process called the Glow and Grow Progress Reflection Worksheet, where students would graph their test scores over time from the beginning of the school year until the end. So you would discuss your glow ups on this worksheet, say what you're proud of, and then you would discuss your areas of growth. So that was a cool system that I also incorporated in my own classroom after that. She also used very playful engagement structures like take the mic, where you would have to like essentially sing your answer. It was this little styrofoam mic. It was cool. So these routines supported visible student ownership. Students taught each other after raising a purple mastery stick. So, for example, sometimes a student would raise a blue stick, which is not as, there in mastery, and the student next to them held up a purple mastery stick would be assigned to help the blue student. And that was like consistently normalized, the supportive area. So I really liked that. It was definitely always a shared community goal to succeed. Succeed. However, I also did notice some moments when students would hold up a purple stick even after scoring low. So, for example, the student that I was sitting next to during this one time definitely scored around 40%, and he had held up a purple stick for understanding and mastery. So I don't know necessarily how they reconcile those two things. So this made me wonder whether like high visible self ratings can sometimes hide insecurity, right? Or pressure students to perform confidence rather than express their confusion, like that student next to me. So the second theme that I want to discuss is about authority and emotional tone. So Miss L holds students to very high standards, often uses direct, blunt accountability language. At times she would say things like, you are choosing to fail my class, especially if you did not come prepared. Or she would call out students publicly if they were missing their work. And they would even share their test scores with the class to kind of gauge where the community was at. But what's interesting is that Miss L always manages to balance that, for the most part, with warmth and humor. And it's about a balance that I honestly don't think that many teachers could pull off. And maybe that's a judgment that I shouldn't say, but you know what I mean. She would be very firm one moment and then joking with students the next. And the students clearly understand her tone shift, right? So they would know when it was time to play and when it was time to get serious and to work, or when she was disappointed in them. After strong reprimands, the room would go quiet. It would be kind of scary. I mean, I was scared myself. Not really, but you know what I mean. And a few students would look discouraged, especially the student that scored 40%, or the ELL student when called out of class. And so that raised the question, do these accountability moves motivate improvement, or do they risk silencing participation especially from quieter or more vulnerable students. My third theme centers on equity, particularly for the ELL student. Across my observations, the student often withdrew after class callouts, and sometimes avoided asking for clarification where it may have been useful. So there were also instances where Miss L seemed visibly irritated or more annoyed is probably the better word when the ELL student approached her with questions instead of like asking it from her seat or his seat, sorry. And I think to be fair, they were taking a test, so maybe I didn't really hear the question that was being asked, so I'm not sure what that frustration was. And again, I want to be transparent because of the highly structured environment. I was worried that I might be stretching my interpretation sometimes, since even small differences in affect or participation were unusually noticeable. Still, taken together, the patterns suggested that maybe public accountability structures can unintentionally marginalize some vulnerable students, specifically emergent English learners. I mean, this student was particularly advanced in their, English language learning journey. So I would wonder if there was someone that's not so, progressed. And this led me to consider lower risk participation options like those think pair shares or the sticky note answers or partner rehearsals before answering publicly, all of which would align better with culturally sustaining pedagogies. So my main takeaways are Miss L's classroom excels in routine, clarity, and frequent formative checks that strengthen mastery and peer support, heavy on the peer support. However, some high stakes accountability moments create emotional cost for some students who are sensitive, shy, or acquiring English in this case. For my own practice, I want to keep strong routines like Miss L, but intentionally add a little bit more low risk entry points here. I also want to monitor how public grade sharing, I wasn't comfortable with that, or admonishment affects participation, and whether that benefit, if there is one, is worth that risk, right? All the while continue to use the concept of a nosa, actively checking for the blind spots of my own authority through peer feedback, student voice data themselves. We do those surveys, reflective journaling, whatever else that I can do. So I apologize that this is a little bit longer, but I originally planned to include a fourth finding that focused on the pressure to teach toward the test, especially given the number of district mandated assessments I observed and her SOL reviews. However, because this was a science classroom, and Ms. L appeared to navigate those requirements as effectively as possible, I wasn't confident that I could analyze that dynamic with the same depth or accuracy, especially since I'm approaching this as an English teacher. Um, for the sake of clarity and a more meaningful presentation, I decided to focus on those three findings. However, that said, I'm open to feedback on whether leaving out that fourth finding was a misstep or if this narrowed focus serves my project better. And I would love feedback on these two questions. Does the ELL student's withdrawal seem like a stable behavioral pattern or more likely a reaction to specific interactions? What evidence should I track to distinguish those possibilities? I'll be in my classroom next year, so I'm very interested in your responses. And what alternatives have you used or have witnessed, observed in place of public reprimands that still maintain accountability, but also reduce shame? And yeah, I just want to say thank you. This has been a great class. I've enjoyed interacting in those discussion posts with you all. Have a good day.